ahead and open your Bibles to Zephaniah chapter 2. We'll be looking at this morning and going through the entire book. What I'm going to do is kind of just go by section and break it down. Again, remember, this is about the day of the Lord. This is about God being a sovereign God, keeping his covenants with Israel and protecting them. And so what's going to happen is this. We're going to look at what God has to say to Israel first. That's going to be at the very beginning. And then we're going to go ahead and look at the other nations, which is very unique to this book and how it affects this prophecy. So let's go ahead and look at verses 1 through 3 and just kind of look at that together. It says, "Gather together, yes, gather, O shameless nations, before the decree takes effect, before the day passes like chaff, before there comes upon you the burning anger of the Lord. Before there becomes upon you the day of anger of the Lord. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, who do his just commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility, and perhaps you may be hidden on the day of the anger of the Lord." In verse 1, we're kind of talking about this aspect of, what is Israel's problem? What is going on? And again, here, Zephaniah is telling the nation to gather together. Why? Well, there's judgment coming. There's judgment coming because of the political situation, because of what's happening in the nation, because of the darkness. And as we discussed last week about what was going on in the nation, it was bleak. It was bad. It was before Josiah's Reformation, and they had a really bad king previous to that. And what we're going to talk about is Zephaniah is basically calling these people to be humble. Why? God's anger is being kindled. And we talked about the Mosaic covenant. And the Mosaic covenant, basically what it's doing is addressing the blessings and the curses, and they're not keeping God's law. And God said to the nation of Israel, you're going to be cursed, you're going to be punished in the event that you don't do that. It says, gather together, the shameful nation. It really talks about, in the Hebrew, gathering a stubble. That's kind of the phrase that's used together. And it's interesting that he's using the word stubble. And the reason why is stubble, it burns fast. If you ever had a chance to take stubble and throw it to a fire, it ignites quickly. And that's what's going on here. It says, listen, we're going to gather the stubble together. You people, you unrepented, stiff-necked people, we're going to gather you together, and my anger is going to consume you like fire consumes stubble. That's kind of the metaphor that he's using here. In verse 2, he refers to the decree of the day of the Lord. This is God's pouring out of his wrath, and Zephaniah is repeating at the end that this is coming. This wrath is coming to you like the day of the Lord, and it's going to be there. There's another context by which chaff is referred to in the Bible, not too many times, but a few times. And every time it's referred to the context of fire. In Isaiah 33, verse 11, it's referred to. Matthew 3:12, and also Luke 3:17. And the wrath of Yahweh must be understood in this context. God's love for his creation and his covenant people does not allow them to pervert the creation or the covenant. And here's the thing about that. There's a couple things that's going on that's being perverted here. One, the creation. They're worshiping Baal. Baal is a god who basically is a thunder god, and basically he oversees the rain, which is very important for the land of Israel. And they're not worshiping Yahweh who causes the rain to fall. They're not worshiping the God of Israel. They're worshiping a different God, hoping that he might do that. And the way that they're perverting it is basically that they basically act like what the gods did. So in Baal worship, there's a lot of temple prostitutes. There's a lot of sexual exploitation found in that, and practices that are very detestable to God, and that's why he hates this so much. And the other thing is his covenant. I mean, he warned them for 200 years through the prophets. Listen, I love you, but like a father, I am going to discipline you. And we saw that with the northern kingdom as he swept away the northern kingdom with Assyria in 72 BC. And Yahweh even brought the Assyrians all the way down to Jerusalem, and they besieged them in 701 BC. And these are the warnings that he gave them. And Zephaniah is warning them, saying, listen, I love you, but like a father to a child, Father's going to discipline a rebelling child in the same way. It It's interesting, in verse 3, Zephaniah kind of changes his tone. He uses the word seek. Seek after the Lord. Seek after Yahweh. Humble yourself and seek after the Lord. And it's really a great word, that word seek. It really doesn't mean like to look for something. Like if you're seeking to find something in a store, you're looking to find what's going on, or I mean, you're trying to find something and seek it. That's not what it is. It really means desire. Desire God. Seek after God with this deep-hearted desire. And the way you do that is by humbling yourself. And basically, the people were commanded to humble, and we see this in other ways with Elijah's day, that they were humbling themselves in 1 Kings 19:18, and that the remnant needs to be humbled. You know, God always reaches out to the remnant, this group, this people, because not the whole nation was rebelling. There was a small group, a lesser group, by which was following God, following his commandments, and they wanted to keep God's word. God's appealing to them. He's saying basically, listen, you humble yourself and you are going to be preserved. You, the small group, are going to be preserved from that judgment against the nation. We see this in the New Testament as well, that God gives grace to the humble. James 4:6-8 says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. Draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinner, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. This theme flows through the scriptures of this humbling aspect of you humbling yourself before holy and righteous God, understanding he is sovereign, understanding he is in full control. Now, in the first 3 verses, it really is a cry to Judah. It kind of goes at the end of chapter 1, where it discusses this rebellious people. And now in chapter 2, he kind of addresses that, but then he pauses. He pauses, and then for the rest of this chapter, he really begins addressing the nations around Israel. He's gonna almost go at all the 4 corners and address he's gonna deal with the west, the east, the north, and the south, and these nations that really have oppressed Israel. It's all kind of funny, is if you're reading this, you're kind of almost thinking, okay, as an Israelite, that is, in the original context, okay, I know that we are rebelling against you. I know that we're doing things wrong, but what about these nations around us, Lord? These nations that have oppressed us, what about this? It's almost like a child, that got in trouble. Johnny got in trouble, and then he's like, well, Sally, my sister, did worse than me, Mom and Dad. Why aren't you punishing her? And the same context is kind of doing that. God's basically saying, okay, I know I'm going to punish my people. I'm going to chastise you, but these nations around you, they're going to be punished as well. Why? Well, they have oppressed God's people. They have punished God's people, and basically they need to be addressed. Most of the other prophets don't really address the other nations. Only Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel kind of prophesy against other nations. Amos does, as well as Nahum and Obadiah are specific, but Amos and Zephaniah are unique because it's not just to one, whereas Nahum and Obadiah are to 2 specific nations, one for each. Zephaniah kind of takes a whole gamut approach, and again, looks at all 4 corners around the borders of Israel and says, listen, you've oppressed. And we're going to deal with those. And what I'm going to do as well is kind of show you a little bit of biblical context of who these people are and what's going on in their lives. So let's look at verse 4. We're going to move our way down to verse 7. We're going to look at the Philistines here. So it says in verse 4, for Gaza shall be deserted, and Ashkelon shall be a desolation. Ashdod's people shall be driven out at noon, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Woe to you, the inhabitants of the seacoast, you nations of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines, and I will destroy you until no inhabitant is left. And you, O seacoast, shall be pastures, the meadows for shepherds and folds of flock. The seacoast shall be a possession of the remnant of the house of Judah, on which they graze, and the house of Ashkelon shall lie down at evening. For the Lord their God will be mindful of them, and restore their fortunes. I love that last phrase, for the Lord their God will be mindful of them. It's not referring to the Philistines, it's referring to Israel, is to restore their fortunes. And give you a little bit of background of the Philistines. The Philistines were a seafaring people. Got a little slide here for you regarding that, kind of give you a map of what's going on. They're seafaring people, most likely came from the nation, what we call Crete today. This is why that Zephaniah calls them Cherethites, kind of a abbreviation of the Cretan aspect. So what happened in around 1200 BC, they decided to invade Israel. And actually more like Egypt. They went down to Egypt and they were pushed back. They arrived in the coastal plains of Israel at the time of the Judges, and they had advanced metal technology. In fact, these were the ones who've, they had some really unique weapons. They had iron. Now you have to understand, in 1200 BC, this is the Bronze Age. Bronze was the main metal at the time. That's what they called the Bronze Age. Well, the Iron Age is the time when iron was actually being used. The problem with iron, though, is not that strong. If you just take iron ore, it's really not the strongest metal out there until you add carbon to it, which makes steel. Well, that's what the Philistines discovered. They discovered that if you were to take iron and put it into a fire and then begin to beat in the carbon, really ash, the hot flames get really hot, that carbon gets embedded in that iron and creates what's we call steel. They're the only ones that knew how to do it. No one else did. In fact, in 1 Samuel 13:19, it says this: "Now there were no blacksmiths," which were the ones who made steel, "to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords and spears." So here's the phrase we see in Israel at that time, that they basically did not have iron technology. They didn't have steel technology. The Philistines did. And so what would happen is that the Israelis would go down to Philistia to get their plowshares made, because they were stronger than the bronze that they had, and they would have them make it for them. It's kind of done in secrecy. It's kind of top secret of how to make this metal. They were a thorn in the flesh for centuries. They were mentioned during the time of Samson's judging, as we see in the book of Judges. We also know that Saul and David had major problems with them. And we see towards the end of David's reign, they kind of were suppressed, and they were not as powerful as they were, but they were still in the area at the time of Zephaniah. So they kind of shrunk down in regards to that. So I want to kind of look at this a little bit. We have a slide up here talking about this, where they came down from Crete. And if you see down here, they came down here and they began to battle against Ramses III. So we'll kind of look at a little slide here of what they looked like. We kind of know that they had some kind of feathered hats. So you see in the slide right here, they did carry mostly axes. Most of the images that we see, they kind of some kind of a warrior skirt and a kind of a tighter shirt around them. They didn't wear too much of baggy clothing. Here's another good slide of what they might have looked like. Their swords were very sharp and narrow, as you can see in this slide here, and they had a lot of colorful decoration. You can see a lot of them have this, what's called Mycenaean 2B decoration on there, which is really a lot of, and this one's black and white, but it'll be two-tone color, and it has a lot of emphasis of birds on it that was on their shields. So, as I discussed, they did battle back in 1200 BC against Ramses III. So here's a relief of Ramses III. He's the big guy on the right-hand side. You can see by his big hat that he's the pharaoh. He has the big arrow. So this is, kind of exaggeration of how big and powerful he is. But this is a relief that you find in Israel. So what happened is the Philistines, they kind of cruised down the coast from Crete, down the coastal plain, and then what they end up doing is they began invading. Well, guess what? Ramses pushed them back. And you see there that his people are doing this. They're pushing these are Egyptian boats right here that are going in there, and they're coming down. You can see the Israelis, but you kind of can see here and there in there these men with the feathered hats. Those are the seafaring people, as Ramses referred to, which are the Philistines. And what happens is they're being pushed back. Some of them, you see them, they're dying in this image. I mean, it's basically a pretty bloody scene. So what happens is, as Ramses pushed them back, they moved up to the modern-day Gaza Strip. That's why the word Gaza is used in verse 4, as we're going to read here in a second. And the Gaza Strip is where the Philistines resided. That's where they were seafaring people, and they basically made 5 capitals, which time they had those cities that we see in the book of Judges, and they were just a thorn in the flesh to Israel, a pain, all the way to the time of Zephaniah. So let's look at verse 4 here. Zephaniah mentions the city of the Philistines under judgment. He mentions 4 cities. He doesn't mention Gath. It's believed at this time that 5th city, Gath, was destroyed at this time, and there was no one there living it. So he's basically just this condemnation to these people of all these. The Gaza shall be deserted. Ashkelon's on the coast. Ashdod is there too, and Ekron's a little bit inland. And they were all destroyed. Verses 6 through 7 talks about these coastal plains, and there's this judgment that they're going to be cleared out. Well, that's kind of unique because during this time, we know that there was a lot of settlements. These 4 cities, and there's some villages around there. And these major cities will become desolate for sheep and shepherds, sheep pens. It's interesting in verse 7 that Zephaniah mentions that it would be Judah's possession. If you look at the history of Israel, even to the modern day, the Gaza Strip has never been occupied by the nation of Israel, not once. Going all the way back to Abraham's covenant and where God promised him the land, this section of the land all the way down to the Nile River was included. So Israel never really fulfilled that promise that Abraham was given, that this is going to be your land. Because that land does expand all the way south and around. This passage illustrates that while Zephaniah spoke against the Philistines, he spoke for the sake of the nation of Judah. It talks about this in verse 5. The word of the Lord is central and determinative factor of the course of history. And the central concern, again, is these people. God's going to destroy this nation. And again, as I went to the end of verse 7, it says, God will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes. Again, the word them is referring to the nation of Israel, restoring their fortunes. So that's the Philistines. That'll be the group to the west. Let's look at Moab and Ammon, which is the group to the east. Let's look at that here, verses 8 through 11. It says, I have heard the taunts of Moab and the reveling of the Amorites, how they taunted my people and boasted against their territory. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Moab shall be like Sodom and the Amorites like Gomorrah, the land possessed by needles and salt pits, a waste forever. The remnant of my people shall plunder them. The survivors of my nation shall possess them. This shall be their lot in return for their pride, because they taunted excuse me, and boasted against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be awesome against them, and he will famish all their gods of the earth, and to him shall bow down, each in its place, all the lands of the nations. Kind of give you a background of this people group. Again, I'll put a map up here. This is a map of Israel, and you see to the east, Moab and Edom. I mean, we're talking about desolate areas. We're talking about a lot of places where there's a lot of dry, arid land. It still could be cultivated, because remember that, in Moab, as you see there over in the east, Ruth came from there. She was a Moabite, and they could grow grains over on that side, and there was some shepherds. And they were always been a thorn in the flesh to Israel. But I want to kind of back up in history. Where did these people come from? Well, that's really important to understand, because God, and through Zephaniah, is kind of doing a wordplay here a little bit in regards of who these people are and their punishment that they are about to receive. So if you turn to Genesis chapter 19, I want to go ahead and look at that. We'll start in verse 30 and kind of look at the origins of this. And really what we see is that these are actually the offspring of Lot's daughters. So look at verse 30. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hill with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve our offspring of our father. So they made the father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down and when she arose, and the next day the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine together tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that you may preserve offspring for our father. So she made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know where she lay down and when she arose. Thus both daughters of Lot became pregnant with their father. The firstborn bore a son, and he was called Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger also bore a son and called him Ben-Ami. And he is the father of the Amorites to this day. You have to remember, when Moses was writing this, this was written as they're about to come into the the land of Israel that was promised to them, and they had to go through these two lands. They had to go through Edom and Moab. They kind of went around those two sections. Those are relatives of the Israelites, but the way they came about was just despicable. I mean, just think about the sin of that and how they came about. Moses encountered the Edomites in Numbers 22 and 24, followed by later conflicts we see in Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Kings, the conflicts with the Ammonites and Judges as well in 2 Samuel, and the book of Nehemiah. So they were just always a problem. They were just a problem to Israel constantly. In 2 Chronicles 24:26 mentions a conspiracy against King David, and the Amorites and the Moabites were included in that conspiracy. And it's interesting that these two nations are judged. And the main reason why is this. Constantly they were coming when Israel was weak. The Moabites and the Edomites would come across the desert and raid the southern portion of that country up through Arad and Hebron, and sometimes down to Beersheba, if you see it over there by the brook, Beersheba. Not really making it to Jerusalem, but there's always a problem. Every time Israel was weak, every time Israel had other issues, they would kind of come in and raid those cities and cause problems, and God's punishing them. Now, you kind of find it interesting that God is punishing them like Sodom and Gomorrah. And you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And basically, Lot and his daughters and his wife left Sodom and Gomorrah because of the sin of the city. And Lot's wife, basically, she looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt. And they came about this despicable city, and it just shows the situation as basically. You remember that situation back then of your ancestors, where you came from and you ran from? I'm going to judge you in the exact same way. You're going to be like that. If you even go to Edom and Moab, that section over there where Moab and Edom is located, it's pretty desolate. It's pretty dry. There's not much there to look at. And so what happens is that this is a desolate land, utter waste. And so we kind of see what's going on here. This is a archaeologist here that was able to go down into this region, down to the south. If we go back to the previous slide, down here, down to the south, over here, down by the Dead Sea, over there by Zoar, on that region just south of the Dead Sea. That's the Red Sea down there. That'll be the Dead Sea up there. And basically what it's describing is the situation of, this place is pretty desolate. So Bryant Wood here is an archaeologist, and he decided to go down to that region just south of the Dead Sea today. And it's interesting, he goes down there and he's digging around, and he finds a layer of burned ground. That's indication of either a nation coming in and destroying it and burning the city, or some kind of natural catastrophe. Remember when we read the book of Genesis about what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, fire and brimstone, or burning brimstone, came down and consumed and burned that area. It's interesting because that word fire and brimstone actually in the Hebrew, it's actually shouldn't be separate from one another. There's actually one word indicating sulfur that burns. I don't know about you, but I've only smelled that once, and my understanding is that that smell is really foul, but it also burns at a very high heat, an intense heat level. So he goes down there, he digs around, and he's like, okay, what does he find that burn level? Well, you see he got some balls here. Guess what those are made out of? Sulfur. Yeah, it looks like he quite possibly found this area where it could have been potentially Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we don't know for absolute sure this is the location that he discovered, but quite possibly could be. So he's finding these balls of sulfur, which really lines up with the biblical text. He finds this burn layer, and then he begins digging around, and guess else what he finds? He finds dead people in that burn layer. And it doesn't. These are homes. I kind of see the skeletons lying here. In here, it's not the greatest image, but you can see the burn areas in there. This is inside someone's home. This isn't a cemetery where you go and find people dead. It looks like these people died in a major natural catastrophe that burned them alive. It's quite possible. So this is kind of the area that he's digging in. Look at it. Desolate, dry. It's interesting when you read the story of Lot. When Lot goes down, during his time, this area was lush and green. So you kind of can see the difference of the climate here. There has been climate change throughout history. I believe that doesn't mean it was different back then. Not necessarily it's always humanly caused, though. We do see that the climate does change based upon God and God changing the climate. So we understand that. But verses 10 through 11 reminds us what happens to the nations that oppose Israel. They'll be destroyed. And we see that this area, like, listen, Edom, Ammon, you're going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember those stories about your ancestors, how they fled that area? Do you remember those? That's going to happen to you. In verse 12, there's just a short mention of a country. It says, you also Cushites shall be slain by the sword. Cushites refer to places somewhere probably near modern-day Sudan or Ethiopia. Basically, it's just that southern group. I mean, we're just basically looking at the way the south is coming in. At this time, Egypt was not a powerful nation, so what was the nation to the south was these Cushites, probably located lower, further down the Nile. And the final group is the Assyrians in verses 13 through 15. So let's go ahead and read that section together here. Zephaniah says, and he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste like the deserts. Herds shall lie down in her midst, all kinds of beasts, even the owl and the hedgehog shall lie in her capitals. A voice shall hoot in the window. Devastation will be on the threshold, for her cedar work will be laid bare. This is an exalted city that lives securely. That said in my heart, I am, and there is no one else. What desolation she has become, a lyre for a wild beast. Everyone who passes her hisses and shakes his fist. The prophecy against the nation climaxes with Assyria. At this time, Assyria is probably the strongest political power in that region. And it kind of just focuses. It's in the north and predicts Nineveh's utter destruction while the Assyrian capitals, basically that's the Assyrian capital. They're saying, Nineveh, you're going to be destroyed. The prediction that Nineveh will be dry as the desert was very remarkable at this time. You have to kind of think about what's going on this time. We think about that region like, yeah, it's that way, right? Well, not during the time of Zephaniah. Nineveh was pretty green and lush. It was a great city that was irrigated, so there was a lot of green gardens inside of that. The river came into the city and out the other side. That's how actually it was invaded later on. The city was large and vast, and basically that river kind of cooled the city off with the cool water, but also irrigated, gave it. And Assyria has been the main oppressor for Judah for almost a century. We saw that when they came from the north and took the 10 tribes and then removed them. They came down and sieged Jerusalem. How oppressing these people are. We're going to talk about that here. Nineveh fell shortly after this prophecy, about 612 BC. The city was very large. When you look at the book of Jonah, there's a little misunderstanding there. In the book of Jonah, it talks about, in Jonah 3:3, it says that the city was so large, it took Jonah 3 days to get there. And some people say, oh yeah, okay, so from the coast of, where he was leaving, the Mediterranean, he went to Nineveh in 3 days. Now, I know there's some supernatural aspect of Jonah in this story, but there's just no way humanly possible. We were talking hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. So this is a long journey from the coast to there. And if you read the text for what it says in Jonah chapter 3, it's really saying Nineveh, the city itself, around is 3 days' journey. That's huge. We're talking a massive circumference. We're talking a day's journey, 15 to 20 miles. And to get around the whole city took 3 days. That's how big the city was. In fact, we were able to go back to Nineveh and kind of see the excavations going on and see that it was a great city. At that time, it was the mightiest city. The walls were about 100 feet high. We do know that the walls were wide enough to accommodate 3 chariots running side by side. They said that they could run 3 chariots on top of the walls. That's how big these walls were. The walls were surrounded by a moat that was estimated to be 150 feet wide and 60 feet deep. And it believed that Nineveh could withstand a 20-year siege. So we're going to kind of look at what the Syrians did and see what's going on here. So here's a picture of the Assyrians as they were invading Jerusalem. This is back in the first invasion. And when they came in, and this is down to the south, and you can kind of see the Assyrians. They had a lot of weaponry. They have slings. You see these slings and these guys that have their arms straight up. There are a lot of bows. And they have a lot of siege machines. So this is Lachish down to the south, just south of Jerusalem. And they have all kinds of weaponry by which they could go in and take siege to a city. They would build these ramps, these siege machines, with kind of think about it as a cart with a big shield in the front of it. They would go up to the wall, and then what they would do is once they get to the wall and the men are protected from the rocks that would be thrown down from the wall or any other type of weaponry, they would begin battering through the wall. That's kind of the image here. They broke through the wall and got through. And so what they did was they were advanced weaponry, and they would come take captive of the people. Well, the Assyrians were pretty ruthless. They basically destroyed people. And their whole idea was once we conquer a people or conquer a city, we oppress those people so much that no one else would ever want to, go against us. We don't want a rebellion to rise up. So I'm going to kind of show you a couple pictures here. This is a picture of a relief. Here, as you see on the left-hand side, that's an Assyrian, either governor or king, and he's doing a couple things here to kind of show how brutal they are. One, you'll see a rope from his hand going to the noses of these. These are Jewish men. These are Israelites. You kind of tell by their beard; it's kind of curly and fashioned. And they would do that to them. They would put them in their nose, or sometimes even a hook under the bottom of the jaw, kind of hold them. You'll see a spear being stabbed into the eye of this Israelite, and also another device going towards his lips. That's more likely a hot brand. They would take a piece of metal, get it hot, and burn their tongues. They would basically take these men, these leaders of Israel, and just do barbaric things to them. Why? To make sure that there's no rebellion. These are who the Assyrians are. We see another picture. This is actually a relief of an Assyrian. You see his hat, kind of more pointed with the long square beard. The curly-haired aspect, those were Israelites. That's probably what they looked like during the time of Zephaniah and prior. They wore robes, and they had the curly, tight beards and tight hair, as you can see that there. So here they're putting their hands up and they're paying homage to, if you expand this relief, you see it paying homage to either a king or a governor of the Assyrians. Here's a really interesting one. Again, you see these two gentlemen laying sideways. And again, we can tell they're Israelites because of their hair. You see the Assyrians, what they're doing here, and they have the pointy hats. So what's going on here is this. This is basically an image of what they would do to people. These men were alive, and basically they would skin them like you would skin an animal and pull the flesh off of them while they're alive. And that's how barbaric it is. You can kind of, it's depicted by the rib cages. You can see the rib cages on there, and that's what they would do. They would grab it and they would literally pull off the skin of their captives, to torture them, to make sure that they weren't going to rebel against them. Here's from that same relief, you'll see them here being appalled by a spear and hung up on a spear. Again, alive. They didn't kill them and put them there. They wanted to be tortured. This is kind of the elementary aspect of crucifixion. This is where it came from. It came from the Assyrians first. The Romans took it and they perfected it. They made it even worse. But yeah, they would basically take a spear, put it up their spine, and line the entryway of the gates. And here's another one here. Again, Assyrian, you see the Israeli heads there, again by their beards, and they would cut their heads off and they would line the gates with the heads of the dead warriors of the Israelites. This is all from Lachish. So this is what they would do. This is kind of the oppressive nature of the Assyrians and why God's punishing them and the desolate. So we see that basically he says, hey, listen, Nineveh is going to be destroyed. This huge city, probably around 50 to 60 miles around in circumference, 100-foot tall walls. I mean, that's just massive. That's 10 stories almost. Wide. No one could oppress them. They could survive for 20 years and they would get destroyed. And what did God say? You look at it, it says, the herds shall lie down in their midst, all kinds of beasts, even the owl and the hedgehog shall lodge in her capitals. Her voice, a voice shall hoot in the window. Devastation shall be on the threshold, and their cedar work shall be laid bare. This is an exultant city that lives securely. They said in her heart, I am, and there is no one else. And in fact, it's so true that there is no one else other than this city. What a desolation she has become, a liar for wild beasts. Everyone who passes by her hisses and shakes her fist. So I want to show you where it resides. This is Nineveh, right here. We've got a little map here. You can see the river running through it. You kind of see the walls. Well, that's a huge area. But look at it today. Today it's grass. Today it's desolate. Today wild beasts are there. And that's God's prophecy coming true right there. That city will be destroyed and never rebuilt. It's now a wasteland. It's just pastures. Animals reside in that location. Now, to kind of give you an idea where this is located, this is Iraq. And if you look down to the south, what do we see there, right? Mosul. We hear that in the news all the time. So it's the same region. I mean, you kind of can see that river that ran through the city and how it would be irrigated. It was lush, it was clean. So we see that God takes care of his people in this book. We see that God in Zephaniah chapter 2 says, yeah, I'm going to punish Judah, but guess what? I'm going to take care of the nations around her. Why? Because of their desolations, because of the things they've done against my people. And I'm going to judge them, which gives them hope. And we're going to see that in chapter 3 as we kind of dive into that he's going to go back to Jerusalem. He's going to talk about the nations. But again, there's going to be a little bit more tone of hope for Israel. Why? God keeps his covenants, and God's going to follow through with his covenants, and he's going to preserve his people, because we see ultimately, as you look through the minor prophets, that God is going to raise up Messiah someday. This judgment's coming, but there's an ultimate reward in the end of God's timetable.